Greetings gamers! Welcome to the first video of 2022 and today I will be trying a new setting. Nandito lang ako sa PC ko kasi I'm gonna try kung maayos tong webcam na ginagamit ko. Ginagamit ko to for streaming. Parang ang pangit ng quality. But I just want to try this out. If it's good, then I'll keep using this. But if it's bad, babalik na ako dun sa old camera ko. Anyway, today the topic for this video will be Intel versus AMD, the top 3 things you need to consider. So if you're planning to build a PC and you're torn between buying Intel or AMD, then this video will guide you to reach that decision. So let's jump right into it with number 1, which is budget. First, you need to make sure na kasya yung bibilin mo sa budget mo. Let me show you some prices first. And I will be comparing Ryzen's 5th gen, the Ryzen 5000 series versus Intel's 11th gen. So first, let us compare Ryzen 5 5600X versus the Intel i5 11600KF. So yung sa Intel, yung K means it's overclockable and yung F means it has no integrated graphics. Tignan natin yung price. The Ryzen 5 5600X costs 15,500 and the Intel i5 costs 14,089 pesos lang. So you can see na mas mahal talaga ang Ryzen 5 5600X versus the 11600KF, which means when you're purchasing an AMD, you would spend more on the CPU. Now let us take a look at the Ryzen 7 and the Intel i7 counterpart. Here we can see that the Ryzen 7 5800X costs 20,250 pesos while the Intel costs 20,879. Bakit mas mahal ang Intel? Kasi meron siyang integrated graphics. Kasi the thing is, walang KF sa store na to. Yung K na lang kinuha ko para pareha silang overclockable. This one has integrated graphics, but if we look at the one without integrated graphics, it will only cost around 18,000. So, in general, yung Intel CPU mas mura kaysa sa Ryzen. But wait, there's more. Hindi lang CPU ang tinitignan natin para sa budget. We also have to consider the motherboard that comes with it. So first, let's talk about AMD. So ang AMD meron siyang A, B, and X na X series na motherboard. Meron akong AMD motherboard guide sa channel ko. I'll link it in the description. So if you're interested about learning more AMD motherboards, you can click on that video and watch it there. But now, let us compare AMD versus Intel motherboards. So all Ryzen CPUs are overclockable. You would need a B series or an X series motherboard para sa AMD para mag-overclock. While for Intel naman, you have H, B, and the Z series motherboard. Yung H and B series, hindi sila pwede mag-overclock. You have to use a Z series Intel motherboard para gamitin yung overclocking feature ng mga K series na Intel. So looking at the prices here, we have the AMD B series, which would cost around 5,000 up to 7, 8, ganon. So we can see the average cheapest price would be around 5,000 to 7,000. Pero the thing is here, pwede mo na siya gamitin pang overclock. While if we look at these Intel Z series, the cheapest you can find is 10,000 pesos na. Kasi nga, itong Z series na to, dun ka lang pwede mag-overclock sa Intel. If we check the Intel B series, it would be the same price naman as the AMD B series. Pero, bawal ka mag-overclock dito. Sure, it's the same price as AMD B series na pwede ka mag-overclock, pero sa Intel, you cannot overclock on the B series. You still need to use an Intel Z series motherboard, which will cost you almost double the price. So take into consideration. Final thoughts for the budget. If you plan on overclocking, then I suggest mag-AMD ka na lang. And if you do not plan on overclocking, you can just get a non-overclockable Intel that would be cheaper than the Ryzen and just get an H or B series na Intel motherboard. So that really depends on you. Gusto mo ba mag-overclock or takot ka ba mag-overclock? Gusto mo all stock na lang? Kung all stock lang gusto mo, Intel. Kung plano mo mag-overclock or learn how to overclock, AMD would be better for you. So the second point when deciding to get a Intel or an AMD CPU will be your usage. So let's start by looking at this photo here. Intel i5 11600K versus the AMD Ryzen 5 5600X. On the right side, we can see the Intel's performance, and on the left side, we can see Ryzen's performance. So we can see that the Ryzen 5 beats the Intel in the majority of things. Makikita natin sa Microsoft Excel, mas mabilis ang Ryzen, sa Adobe Photoshop, sa Blender, sa Handbrake, sa multi-core, Adobe Premiere, yung video editing and yung Photoshop, the Ryzen beats the majority. While Intel here, it wins in single cores, which is for gaming, and encryption and decryption, probably di mo kailangan yon. You probably don't know what that's for. In majority, the Ryzen 5 5600X beats the Intel in terms of productivity. Now let's see the gaming performance. So we have a small list of games here. On the left side is our Ryzen and on the right side is our Intel. As you can see, the Ryzen 5 5600X performs better on CPU intensive games. Tignan natin yung CSGO. Ang CSGO is more CPU intensive. Parehas lang yan sa games like Valorant, League of Legends. So the Ryzen is the clear winner here. Pero the Intel i5 can beat Ryzen in terms of bigger games. Tignan natin yung Battlefield 5. We can see that konti lang yung lamang ng Intel on Ryzen 5. And the reason kung bakit may lamang yung Intel is because they have faster single core performance. So on games na CPU intensive, the Ryzen can win over Intel. But in other games na mas ginagamit yung GPU, Intel will give you a little bit more performance. Now let us check naman the 1440p. And now sa 1440p, we can see things start to balance out. Kung kanina nakita nyong 3% slower yung Intel i5, ngayon 1.46 slower na lang. So on average, kahit 1080p or 1440p, mas malakas pa rin ang Ryzen. It has more advantages or more wins over the Intel in certain games. Before we go to the third point, tignan naman natin yung 7 variant. Sa 7 variant naman, on the right side, we have our AMD Ryzen 7 5800X, and on the left side, we have our Intel Core i7 11700K. We can see na sobrang laki ng difference ng Ryzen versus Intel. Tignan mo, 4% faster on average yung 5800X over the Intel Core i7. If we look at the games closer, we can see na around 28% ang lamang ng Ryzen 7 over the Intel i7 sa World War Z, which is Vulkan. So apparently, Vulkan performs better on AMD than Intel or Nvidia. And yung panalo naman ng Intel dito is Cyberpunk, Far Cry, Doom Eternal, and Star Wars. Pero sobrang liit ng difference. You can see only 1 and 2% difference, while yung AMD Ryzen 7 has a big 28% difference sa isang game, World War Z. So in summary, Ryzen has more wins over Intel, but it comes at a price. Ryzen CPUs are more expensive and probably harder to find kasi nagkakaubusan yung mga stock and most likely inflated na kapag bibili ka ngayon. Pero if you have low budget and you don't mind running on all stock, then Intel has a better bang for the buck para sa'yo. And for my last point, we have upgradeability. For upgradeability, this means kung bumili ka ng Ryzen 5000 ngayon with a B550M, how much more generations can your B550M last? Rewind muna tayo. Let us see the AMD B450M. It can support Ryzen 2nd Gen, 3rd Gen, 4th Gen, and 5th Gen. That's 4 generations already. Pero yung mga Intel boards, they only support maybe 1 or 2 generations. Example, yung H510, it will only support your 10th gen, 11th gen. Hindi ako sure kung supported ang 9, pero it will only support 1 or 2 generations. While yung AMD's AM4 platform, mas maganda yung upgradeability niya. So sabihin natin bumili ka muna ng Ryzen 3rd Gen. Bumili ka ng B450M pati Ryzen 3400G. Pero in the future, nagkapera ka. Bibili ka ng Ryzen 7 5th Gen 5800X. Di mo na kailangan i-upgrade yung motherboard mo kasi yung B450M mo, i-update mo lang yung BIOS and kaya na niya mag-support ng Ryzen 5000. So in terms of upgradeability, mas lamang pa rin ang Ryzen. And now, my personal opinion and what do I think about Intel and Ryzen. So my personal opinion, go for Ryzen. Ryzen offers much more performance, although it's more pricey pero worth naman. It has better upgradeability, it has better CPU support, and it also has better overclocking potential, and it's cheaper to overclock than buying an Intel Z series na pwede mong i-overclock. So if you're someone who wants to have a good performing PC, go for Ryzen. But if you're someone who likes to run all stock, or kung medyo mababa yung budget mo and you want to squeeze in more budget for your GPU, for your storage, for your RAM, ganun, go for Intel na lang. Kung wala ka naman pa kayo mag-overclock, gusto mo all stock, all the temperatures are nice and cool, ayaw mo uminit, go for Intel, get the F series na lang kung bibili ka ng GPU, and save your money for a bigger GPU. But for Ryzen, if you have more money to spend, you're planning on overclocking, get the Ryzen instead. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching and I hope I see you in the next video.